Well, welcome back again, folks, for the next video in the sequence, this one on interview 3. I hope that you're not getting too inundated and overwhelmed with videos. That's the only way that I know how to really communicate with you during the online class schedule where we don't get to see each other in the classroom face to face. Hopefully you're watching these things from start to finish and getting some good information out of them to prepare you for quizzes, coming up with the test, and the little additional videos where I keep you posted on what's going on during the week and next week, and the instructional videos on the various assignments that you have to do. It can get overwhelming, I'm sure. I'm trying real hard to keep these lecture videos to maybe 30 minutes or less, so that it's a bite-sized chunk. And hopefully the way that we've got them loaded out here, you've got the ability to watch part of it now and then pause it and come back and watch the other part of it later, or listen to it without watching it while you're doing something else. Hopefully the effort that I'm putting into recording these things during the summer semester, or the beginning of the summer semester, is providing some value to you. Let me know how things are going. But again, we're in lesson 3 in the interview sequencing of material, and following the conclusion of this interview 3 video, you'll pretty much know what you need to be able to start working on your hiring matrix, because that's mostly what we're talking about in this video, is how we select candidates, and the matrix is a tool we use to do that. Because you've looked at interview lecture 2, you've got a pretty good idea of how to go about creating your questions, so hopefully you're already working on your question set. As a reminder, those things have to be very, very carefully chosen and carefully worded to make sure that we don't get into any trouble in the process. So spend some time thinking about those and working on those. But as we talk about the interview methods of selecting candidates, we want to consider that there are a lot of different ways to take the information we get from interviews and make a decision on maybe who comes back for a next interview, or who gets provided with an opportunity to join our team. And the first idea of which is used by a lot of organizations is what we call the multiple hurdles approach. If you think about a track meet, if you're watching on ESPN, or you're at the high school watching your little brother run track or something, the hurdles are the series of little contraptions that are spaced every so often, every 50 feet or whatever it is. And the runner starts in the starting position, the gun goes off, they start running as fast as they can, and when the runner comes up to that hurdle, he has to jump over the thing, so it slows him down a little bit. And you can't finish the race without going over each one of the hurdles. Now, sometimes in the real life of the hurdles race, you actually hit the top of the thing and knock it down, and there's no necessarily penalty to that. Some rules state a little bit of a penalty and some don't, but it does slow you down a little bit. But the idea in the hurdles is that you cannot win the race without dealing with each of the hurdles, and ideally going over the hurdles cleanly. You take that concept and you apply it to the interviewing process, and the idea is that in order to get hired with us or to join our team, you've got to do a series of things, and you have to pass each one of those things. If there comes a point in time where you don't pass one of those things, then you have eliminated yourself from consideration. So think about it, the process, like you've got an application that is fully completed, you've got a first interview, you've got some sort of a personality test, perhaps you have a work assignment where we test to see if you can do this thing, then maybe you've got a second interview, and then maybe you've got, if you've gotten that far, you've got a criminal background check, you've got a medical screen, drug test kind of thing, and each of those things stands alone. Each one of those things in the multiple hurdles approach could disqualify you from consideration. So if you don't do an adequate job of filling out your application, if you leave blanks, maybe we say, okay, we're going to pass on you and go to the next one. Maybe you get through that and you come to the first interview and you don't do well. Okay, we're going to take you out of consideration. The rest of you continue to go forward. So you're going over a series of hurdles, and at each one of those hurdles, you've got to achieve some sort of predetermined score. score. It may be a yes or a no. It may be an 80 out of 100, whatever the case may be. But if you don't meet that basic minimum, again, with the application, maybe it's a yes, no. Did you do it right? Did you not do it right? But there's a series of decision points all along between the hurdles. We're doing some evaluation, looking back at the hurdle they just crossed, looking ahead to the next hurdle, having conversations about who's still in the process. And in theory, you get to the end of the race or the end of the process, and there's one candidate left who's cleared all of the hurdles, and that's the person that you hire. So the thing that I really want you to remember from the multiple hurdles approach is that it is very possible, it's rather common to set up a system where there's a series of blocks or hurdles, and you got to clear every single one of them. Missing on any one of them eliminates you from consideration. So multiple hurdles is one way to do this. Another way that we can figure our before I go ahead, some notes here. Again, I'm not looking ahead at my paper copy of this. One of the problems with multiple hurdles is that there are a lot of different pieces that have to happen in a sequence. It's hard to do these things at the same time. So it takes more time. You might have to have your candidate come in multiple times to do different things. But we would use the multiple hurdles when we've identified criteria that are really, really important. And it would make sense that if you can't complete this hurdle, then you're not a good fit for this organization. And it's pretty common to use when we've agreed ahead of time as a team that these particular hurdles are really, really important. But we typically wouldn't use a hurdle if it's something that's not that big of a deal. The hurdles are only the big things that if you can't complete this hurdle, then you're not, by practice, by history, going to be successful in this team. Now we move to the second one. After the multiple hurdles, we have the idea of the compensatory approaches. And that word compensatory looks like compensate. What we mean by compensate is that something helps something else. If you have poor eyesight, you wear glasses to compensate. If you don't hear well, you have a hearing aid to compensate. Something that compensates helps something become better. So the compensatory approach is the idea that you've still kind of got these hurdles, but it's not so critical if you don't get over one hurdle, because maybe you allow one hurdle to carry more weight to offset poor performance in another hurdle. So what you might say is that you've still got this application, you've still got these 2 interviews, you've got this personality test and everything. Maybe you don't do well in the first interview, but if you do well on the personality test, we'll kind of overlook a little bit that first interview. Or maybe if we give you a typing test and we're really hoping for 60 words a minute and you do 45, and it's normally in the multiple hurdles, you'd say you didn't hit 60 words a minute, you're no longer going to be considered. But with the compensatory approach, you might say, we'll kind of make that a little less critical as long as you do really well on this job preview kind of thing. So the idea is that one assessment can offset slightly another assessment if you do really well on one and really poor on another. But you would have to know ahead of time, you'd have to make some decisions ahead of time on which ones can compensate for which ones. It's not just like in a classroom where you say, let's take all the tests and drop the lowest. You kind of have figured out ahead of time, we're going to take the higher of 1 or 2. Or we're going to allow 1 to take a bigger weight than 2. But you kind of figured that out ahead of time. You might use this, as you see in the second bullet point there, if you have specific talents that need to be there, but they're not as important as other talents. So they can exist at a minimum level. As long as you've got a minimum level, you don't have to hit some predetermined standard, but there's probably some sort of a minimum standard. So if your typing test needs to be 60 words a minute, it's not such that if you don't type 60, you're gone. It may be that if you type 45, you're still in consideration, but there is a bottom level. If you don't type at least 40, we can't even use the compensatory approach. And there are different approaches or methods of using the compensatory approach. One of them is called the unit weighting. And that is a situation where you look at each one of those hurdles or each one of those tests or things that you're doing, and they all initially have an equal weight. in determining a final score. So going back to the classroom illustration, test 1 is 100, test 2 is 100, test 3 is 100, test 4 is 100. Each of them are equal weights, but you can allow some of them to offset the other ones. But the theory is at the beginning that everything is important equally, everything has value equally. And when you have that situation where there is a piece that you can legitimately say is not quite as important and can be reduced a little bit, then you've got a little bit of an issue mathematically through standard deviations and so forth to say, well, it's on paper worth 100, but if we're going to discount it a little bit, we got to do some mathematical approaches to figure out how we're going to compensate and how we're going to re-equalize the weighting, since it's not going to be 100 to 100 to 100 to 100 as we look across the board. Another way that we can do it is rational weighting. In that case, not everything is worth 100 points. You might say, as you look at these things, this one's more important than that one, so we're going to have a weight of 20% on that versus 10% on that. You can actually see that in practice by looking at our syllabus. And if you remember back to the syllabus when I did the video where I talked through it and you looked at it, tests are each worth 100 points. The job description is worth 100 points. The recruitment plan is worth 100 points. The interviews are worth 100 points. So it looks like we're using unit weighting where everything's worth 100. But I've gone in and said, no, the interviews, which are worth 100 points, is really 30% of your grade. And the tests, which are 100 points each, are really 20% of your grade. So it would appear that doing well on one test equals doing well on the interviews. And yet each one of those 3 exams is only worth 1/3 of 20%, where the 100-point interviews is worth 30%. So as you look at the bullets here, an expert, in this case with our syllabus, me, the expert, assigns a different subjective weight to each piece. I have subjectively said that the interviews are worth 30%, because I think that's an important part of this class. And then as you look at the individual things, the 3 tests, the job description, the questions, the hiring matrix, the recruitment plan, the interviews, all those things that are all worth 100 points each, but weighted at 5% or 10% or 20%, it's not so much that the hundreds add up to something that is meaningful, but more so that the percents add up to something that is meaningful. So the bullet point 2 there, each of those pieces, which is subjectively weighted, when we look at the subjective weights and add them together, it all adds up to 100. And you can see from the 3rd bullet point that it can be very subjective. When you look at our syllabus, you may be inclined to say, well, why does the interview count 3 times as much as there's probably not a real good comparison because I don't remember anything that's 10%, but the questions in the hiring matrix are effectively 7.5% each. The quizzes all combined to be 5%. So each one of those 10 quizzes is worth 1/10 of 5%, which is 0.5%. The interviews is worth 30. Each quiz is worth 0.5. How do you rationalize that there's that big of a discrepancy? It's very subjective, and it can be hard to deal with. So you have unit weighting. Everything's basically the same. You have rational weighting where there are percentages applied to each thing. And then you have statistical weighting, which is similar to rational, except that you build into it now some statistical methods like multiple regression, which eliminates a little bit of the subjective score, but adds into the process the complexity of doing a whole lot of more complicated math. Another variation of that is a multiple regression technique, and we see is in the bullet point there that this is the most scientific approach, and it frankly is beyond my pay grade. I don't understand the statistics part of it and the multiple regression part of it, but if you're really into that kind of stuff and you really want to make a scientific process of selecting candidates, that may be a good way to do it. Each assessment computes together to contribute to an overall score. As we look at the statistical weighting approach, here's an example of how that might work. We're trying to get ultimately an overall score, as you see in the first formula here. And we may say that there's four pieces of our score, or 4 things that you've got to do. Perhaps you've got 3 different little tests. you've got an interview and so forth, and you've got these individual scores. C is one thing, B1, B2, and B3 are pieces, and each of those pieces is weighted differently. So let's say that we have a candidate come through, and each one of the candidates has an interview, has a personality test, and has a cognitive ability test, and then there is some sort of score that we come up with that's not related to that. So we have those individual scores, and we know what the weights are. Let's say that this particular person got a 24 on whatever this C is here. And then on the cognitive ability test, the individual got a particular score that's weighted at 20%, and the interview is weighted at 25%, and he or she got a particular score when it happened. And on the personality test, he or she got a particular score that's weighted at 15%. So with that breakdown of the formula, let's say that the cognitive ability score was a 70 and it's weighted at 20%. The interview score was a 75, which is weighted at 25%. And then there is, and these don't add up to 100. That's not necessarily necessary that they do add up to 100, but we have indicated that they're not all valued the same in our process. The personality score, let's say, was a 50 and weighted at 0.15. You can plug numbers in then and take 70 times 0.2, subtotal that, put it off to the side, take 75 times 0.25, get that answer, put it off to the side, take 50 times 0.15, take that answer and put it off to the side, and then add those three numbers to the base 24, and it gives us a score of 64.25. Why is that important? Because each one of your candidates has different scores on these cognitive abilities and interviews and personalities and whatever made up this score. And when you weight these things and plug them into the formulas, every one of your candidates ends up with a value number. Then all you got to do is look at this number for each of your candidates. Somebody got a 64.25 and somebody got a 68.91. Well, theoretically, based upon what you think is important in terms of their weights, you look at those two scores and you say 69 is better than 64, so we hire the 64. As you can see, it can be very, very complex. It's got to have an awful lot of thought put into it in terms of what the pieces are and what we value them. Now notice up here I've got the three little dots, which suggests that there could be a whole lot more pieces. And ideally all these things add up to 100, but they don't necessarily do that. But it takes a lot of time, just like creating a job description, doing the job analysis process. Takes a lot of time to figure out what the proper formula up here is. But once we know that formula, it becomes very easy to implement the pieces of it, to get scores on those pieces and just plug them into an Excel spreadsheet or calculator and have it generate what that overall score is, and then move forward from that. So hopefully that it makes a little bit of sense. It's not something that you necessarily have to know for our test purposes, and maybe not even know for real life purposes, but it's good to know that there's a lot of different approaches that we can use to build in some scientific credibility to what we're doing. And again, remember that the more scientific, the more mathematical, the more objective rather than subjective this is, the easier it is to defend the decision, the easier it is to push back if we're charged with any kind of discrimination. No, it's mathematical. You know, the only thing that you could really protest here is why we're using a personality test, perhaps, because maybe that in itself is discriminatory, but the process isn't so much. Well, moving on to the next slide, you've got the hurdles approach and you've got the compensatory approach, but life is not always either or, and it's very possible and probably likely in most cases that you're going to use a combination of the two. There are some things that are absolutely essential, and if you can't do those things, you're gone. But there are other things that aren't as essential, so you might have some hurdles and some compensatory. So as you look at the bullet points here, summary of what we've just said, there are some critical do-or-die points, and remember the term cut points or cut scores. Those are those basic level, minimum level scores that you gotta hit or you don't get anything. But there are other pieces that if you do reasonably well, you can continue to move forward because you're going to be offset in that reasonable score by something that's much better. as we're making our final choice, we've got these candidates that have gone through all of these different things. We've measured them somehow. We've got all of these notes. Perhaps at any point along the way as we're talking about the hurdles, or perhaps at the very end as we're looking at the final answers and the final numbers from that, multiple regression or statistical weighting kind of approach to things, and the formulas and the 64.25s and whatnot, maybe the way that we make our decision on who to hire is through the use of what we call a cut score. And you're going to want to remember this idea for testing purposes. A cut score is that minimum level that you have to meet in order to move to the next stage or to get that job offer. So we take everybody and we kind of line them up from top to bottom. And let's say that the situation, if the situation is we're only hiring one person, it's the top person. That's all there is to it. But in a situation where we're trying to hire 4 customer service reps or 3 bank tellers, and there's a bunch of them, there is a line. Maybe it is the top 3, or maybe it's like we're not real sure how many people. We're admitting people into a program of study at college, and we don't know whether it's going to be 30 or 100, but we do know that we only want to bring in people that have a certain GPA or that have a certain score on the SAT or whatever. So we rank people from top to bottom, and then we determine what that number is. Maybe that number on the SAT is 1200. So we draw a line at 1200, and that's the cut score. Everybody below 1200, you got a different program that you can pursue. Everybody 1200 or over has the option of joining this program or not. Great example is a golf tournament. Everybody goes out, they play that first round, that second round, whatever. At the end of the second round, you look at their scores, really in the golf tournament perspective from low to high, and everybody, let's say that you've got a general idea that you start with 100 and you can take 50 in the next round of play. So somewhere in the 50th range from low to high is where you draw that line. But it could very well be that you don't care whether it's 50 or 60 or 30. You have to have shot, if it's a par 70, let's say, that's not a real number for golf, but let's say that it's a par 70, 2 rounds would be a 140, so let's say we'll give them a little bit of a benefit. Everybody who scores a 145 or lower moves on to the next round. Well, that 145 is your cut score. Hopefully that makes sense. Another way that we can make our final choice is through rank ordering, which is the same idea that you rank them from highest to lowest, but you draw a line somewhere. So it's not a particular score you're trying to hit, but it is more so that you're trying to be in the top 20, whatever that score happens to be. Again, the difference between the cut score and the rank ordering is that the cut score says we're looking on a personality test at people who score 80 and above, and it may be 3 of you and it may be 100 of you. As long as it's an 80, that's the score. With the rank ordering, we line up all 100 of you and we're taking the top 12. And the top 12 may have a score of 92 or above, and the top 12 may have a score of 62 or above. It doesn't matter what the score is, it's the top 12 no matter what. The Olympics are an example of that, where we say everybody's going to perform, we're going to take the top 7. It doesn't matter what your score is, perhaps. The next thing that we can do in terms of our final choice is banding. And that's the idea where if you're within a range, you get selected. Hiring within the band, it says in the first bullet point there, is done randomly or based on other factors. It allows us to take a lot of different things into consideration. An example is school grades, which you're very familiar with. The band is 90 to 100, that's an A. And the thing about banding is that as long as you hit that mark, it doesn't matter what your score is. You get the same A with a 91 as somebody else does with a 99, right? Theoretically, that 99 is better than you are, but you both have an A. As far as the transcript goes, you got an A. And somebody looking at that transcript sees an A and really doesn't know whether it's a 90.0 or a 99.9, and they can assume either one. All that really matters is that you got within that band of 90 to 100, or you got within that band of 80 to 89. This is the final slide of the presentation here, so we're about done with the video. When you're using the cut score or the rank ordering, you've got to make some other decisions. about whether you are going to use this as your final decision or whether this is going to be the pool from which you make your final decision. In other words, are we going to take the top three? We've got 3 positions to fill, and we've got 12 candidates. Are we going to take the top 3 no matter what? Or are we going to use this listing to take the top 5 or the top 7 and then do one more thing to select the 3 of the 7? So as you see from looking at the information here, there's a lot of different ways to go about making a decision. Hopefully you've got a good process, you've got good scoring mechanisms, they're valid in terms of the scores that people receive. You've got a great plan in place for how you use those numbers to create final tallies. And then what you do with those final tallies is kind of up to you. Now, since we've looked at all 3 of the interview, you're certainly ready now to take the quiz over this material, but you're also ready. You're already working theoretically on the interview questions, but you're ready to start thinking about your tool, which is your hiring matrix. It kind of takes into account some of the concepts from this lecture, although we don't go into any detail about what that matrix looks like. And I say going into this that this is an exercise for this class to help you think about what's important. And you might not ever use one of those things in real life. In fact, I would imagine that most people who interview don't have a tool like this that exists on paper, but they've got it in their head. They know what they're looking for. So when you get ready to do your hiring matrix later on this week, certainly depending on what semester you're watching this video, what you want to be doing is thinking about what's important to you and figuring out how you're going to measure that. And you're going to be making decisions about whether those are hurdles or whether those are compensatory items, and how it all adds up into the final total. If it is rank scoring, if you're going to use statistical weighting, unit weighting, any of those kinds of things. The way that you go about making a decision on who to hire is up to you. It's up to your organization, your department. But for this purpose, for this particular class, it's really kind of your decision. And the way that you make your decision on who to hire is not something that I'm really going to question you on. But you need to be able to defend it to make sure that it's fair in terms of distributive fairness, procedural fairness especially, and that we don't put ourselves in a position where folks can complain later on. Hopefully that gets you enough information about interviewing to where you now understand from lecture 1 the setting of the interviews, from lecture 2 about the kinds of questions that you ask, and from lecture 3 about how you use numbers in the process to make decisions along the way. And with that information, you're really kind of ready to start thinking seriously about how you're going to interview people and how you're going to make decisions about who to hire. The next sequence of videos will cover another interesting topic. As I rearrange these things from time to time, semester to semester, where it stands right now, we move on to chapter 6. But if you're in a semester where I don't use the same order, it's going to be something different. So you might ignore the last part of this video and move on with whatever happens to come next. Hope you're doing well in the class. You're learning a lot. You're having an enjoyable time. You're getting your questions answered, and you're feeling good about the project that's coming of interviewing. If not, let me know what we can do to make it better. Bye for now.